Where do we go now? Clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Northern Ireland Executive Formation Bill, second reading.
Now.
Minister to move second reading.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the bill now be read a second time. And it is a very short and I'd like to think perfectly formed bill. And I'd like to thank all those who have helped expedite this simple but important piece of legislation to this point. As Secretary for Northern Ireland, my focus has always been on facilitating the return of devolved institutions and upholding the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in all its strands. This bill is no different and hopefully plays a part in that. The UK government believes in the agreement. It believes in devolution. It believes in localism, and it strongly believes in power sharing. That is why I am today legislating to retrospectively extend the executive formation period to the 8th of February this year, 2024. The people of Northern Ireland deserve and elect locally elected decision makers and want them to address the issues that matter to them. This very short extension, provided for by the legislation, will create the legal means to allow the Northern Ireland Assembly to sit and get the executive up and running as soon as possible. Importantly, a restored executive will have access to the significant financial package I announced before Christmas, worth over £3.3 billion, to secure and transform Northern Ireland's public services. Ministers will be empowered to immediately begin working to address the needs of local people and unleash Northern Ireland's full and amazing potential. And this bill helps deliver that outcome and support the return of devolved governance to the citizens of Northern Ireland. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, for now, on that note, I conclude my remarks and I commend the bill to the House.
Question has the bill be now read a second time? Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. Another year and another bill to postpone the Northern Ireland Assembly elections. Mind you, it is worth noting that the last time we did this, something quite significant happened 5 days later when the Windsor framework negotiations were concluded. So let us live in a state of hope, tempered, as always, by experience. Can I begin by thanking the Secretary of State for introducing the bill in such a timely fashion. We support it. I have met no one who thinks that holding elections now would help resolve the difficulties that Northern Ireland's politics are currently in. But while we may be in agreement about the need for this bill, I don't think we should let this moment pass without acknowledging that the Assembly elected, 20 months ago, has still not yet been able to meet. And in any other democracy, anywhere in the world, that would be a cause of anger, not to say uproar, because the very essence of a democratic election is that the representative body should be able to meet and do its job. And I would just observe that Northern Ireland surely cannot continue to be the only place where this does not happen. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for the discussions that we have had between us. It is a pleasure to do business with him. And as my predecessor, the Honourable Member for Hove, said just under a year ago, and I quote him, "It would of course be better if this legislation was not needed. Northern Ireland is a valued part of the United Kingdom and restoring the Stormont Assembly and the Executive should be a priority for the government." Well, I know that it is a priority for the Secretary of State because he spent so much time negotiating with the DUP to try and find a way forward. And from the moment I took on this role, I have tried to support him and the government in that objective. And now, with the negotiations, it appears, having effectively concluded, we've come to the moment of decision. And I hope that the DUP will return to government. I think the DUP should return to government. And I say that for a host of reasons, above all because the people of Northern Ireland need to have their government back. The consequences of having no government for almost 2 years this time around, and of course previously for almost 3 years when Sinn Féin walked out of the institutions, are very serious for the people of Northern Ireland. As we know, the Assembly can't even elect a Speaker, so it can't meet. Difficult decisions are not being taken. The public finances are in a parlous state. When the flood struck last year and affected so many businesses and homes, there was no government instalment for people to turn to for help. None.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Of course I will give way.
When I was at home over Christmas, I took my uncle to the Cancer Specialist Centre at Belfast City Hospital. It was a very humbling experience to see the care and the dedication provided by the staff there in what is a world-leading facility. But the stresses and the strains were very clear, a lack of funding and a lack of direction, because when institutions and systems fail, people suffer. So this really has to be the last time that legislation like this comes before this House. Get it back up and running, or the Secretary of State with the Irish Government should find something else to sort it out.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend that this is the moment to get the institutions back up and running, and I wish the person he referred to all the best with their treatment. The civil servants, of course, are left to make decisions that really ought to be made by elected representatives. And in the case of public sector pay, for example, with some workers not having had a pay rise for almost 3 years, it should hardly bear repetition. No decisions have been taken because there isn't enough money in the budget to do so. Now, that's why there was such a large strike last week, and I see that there's likely to be further industrial action coming towards us. And I think everyone now recognises, including the government, that that is not a sustainable position, and the proof on the government side is that in announcing the financial package, it identified money for public sector pay, although it is not currently being released until such time as the executive is restored. Now, if I may be really frank, I understand why the Secretary of State took that decision initially, but I must say to him that I think in relation to public sector pay, that moment has now passed, and that's why I called on him last week to release that part of the budget package so that the disputes can be settled, workers can get their pay increases, and public services can try to address the many, many challenges they face. I will, of course, give way.
Thank you for giving way, and he's making a very important point, because, of course, many public sector pay awards have been made, nearly 50 over the last year. And the only reason why the current one is not being made is because the Secretary of State is holding teachers, nurses, etc. as pawns in the game which he's playing and the efforts he's trying to make to force us into a position to make a decision that he wants us to make and we don't wish to make.
Well, the honourable gentleman links the pay question to the stance that he takes in relation to the current difference of view that the DUP has with the Windsor Framework and the Protocol. I would say to him in return, it is equally true that if the DUP were to go back into government, then public sector workers would get their pay increase. And that's why I said a moment ago that I hope very much that that will be the case. Now, turning to the substance, I will, of course.
I thank the Shannon Minister for giving way. Shannon Minister, I'm aware from back home from the papers, from the TV correspondence, from media statements made by those in unions. They say very clearly, and I quote them, that the problem here doesn't lie with the politicians, with respect, it lies with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who has control of the money. He, in his own right, as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, could settle these claims for those in education, those in health and elsewhere. The monies are there. The unions say, let the Secretary of State do it. Has he heard the same story as I've heard? I've heard it in the news and the media.
Well, I have indeed heard the unions making precisely that point. And I have set out to the House today why I understood initially why the Secretary of State took that approach, but I do think that public sector workers should not continue to be held hostage to the failure thus far, and I hope that it will change very soon to solve this problem, which is why I am calling on the Secretary of State to release the funds now. Now, we need to be honest about how we got to the deadlock that the government's been grappling with, as indeed has the Right Honourable Gentleman for Lagan Valley as leader of his party. One of the many, many consequences of leaving the EU was that a decision had to be taken about what to do about trade across the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, given that everyone agreed that the border had to remain open. There were not many things that everyone agreed on when it came to Brexit, but that was one of them. And everyone agreed that the EU needed to be sure that goods crossing that border complied with the rules of their single market. There was no escaping this. And the government decided that the answer would be the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, before I occupied this role, I was one of many people who argued that the implementation of the protocol would not work as originally intended in Northern Ireland, including for reasons that many in the Unionist community had pointed out. And in fairness to Maros Sefcovic, he understood what the problems were and changed the EU's approach. And that is why I genuinely believe that the Windsor Framework represents a significant step forward. It's why we on this side of the chamber voted for it. Now, of course, detailed implementation will need to be worked through. That is another reason why the executive needs to return. But most businesses tell me that the Green Lane is working reasonably well. And as I said last week, the framework is here to stay. And I make no apology for reinforcing the point again today, because it will continue to be implemented by whoever is in government in Westminster. And anyone who thinks otherwise, with respect, has got it wrong, not least because any hope of negotiating future arrangements of benefit to Northern Ireland with the EU will depend on the Windsor Framework being implemented. Because if the UK were once again to renege on an international agreement it has signed, and it's happened before, there would be, for example, no SPS agreement reached or anything else, because trust would once again have been destroyed. Absolutely destroyed. At the same time, of course, unlike the rest of the UK, Northern Ireland continues to enjoy ready access to both the UK and EU markets, which is a huge opportunity for jobs and economic growth in the years ahead. And these are the facts which nothing is going to change. Now, what the government has been doing, we all understand, is negotiating on measures it could take to reinforce Northern Ireland's position in the UK internal market. And the Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley has wisely and repeatedly said, and I support him in this, that any agreement has to be acceptable both to Unionists and to nationalists. And that has shown great wisdom. In addition, there is a financial offer on the table, which I think provides a basis for going forward. So after months of negotiation between the government and the DUP, now is the moment to decide whether to restore the institutions. Now, on the detail of the bill, and there's not much, I have just one question. In his press statement on the 19th of January, the Secretary of State said, and I quote, "I intend to introduce new legislation which will take a pragmatic, appropriate and limited approach to addressing the executive formation period and support Northern Ireland departments to manage the immediate and evident challenges they face in stabilising public services and finances." End of quote. Now, I take it from those words he was referring actually to another bill that he thinks might be needed if the current negotiations fail. Can he confirm that that is the case? I'm not asking for any further detail, although I hope, we all hope, that such a bill will not prove necessary because the institutions will return. Also, can the Secretary of State assure the House that as and when there is an outcome, indeed either way, he will immediately come to the House and make a statement? Oh yes, of course I will give way.
For giving way. Would he agree with me that he talked in the questions to the Secretary of State about Plan Bs and alternatives, but would he agree with me that any alternative to restoration of the institution is suboptimal and is also not the settled position of this House? All parties have as their primary policy position on Northern Ireland governance the restoration of the institution.
I agree 100% with what the right honourable gentleman has just said, and he anticipates a point I'm just about to come on to make in my concluding remarks. And they are these, that Northern Ireland has come a long way since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998. It is unrecognisable in so many ways, and for the better. And in all of my meetings, all of my visits, I've been so impressed and encouraged by the energy, the enterprise, the industry of those I have met who are working hard to build a new and better future for the people of Northern Ireland. And that really matters when we know that families in Northern Ireland, for example, have the lowest disposable incomes in the United Kingdom. And the longer there is no functional devolved government, the harder it will be for those businesses to seize the opportunities that are available anyway, including because of access to the EU market, because businesses that are thinking of investing don't like uncertainty. They want stability. They want to know there is a government in place. And so the absence of a government undermines the bright future that otherwise faces the people of Northern Ireland. And the basis of power sharing, which was at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement, including devolved government, was essential to the making of progress. And of course, although there have been bumps and difficulties along the way and periods of no government, a generation on from 1998, I simply want to echo the point the Right Honourable Gentleman has already made, that we cannot give up on devolved government. It is what we believe in this House. And it is the responsibility that all of us take on when we stand for elected office. We can't really have a system where any of us chooses to put conditions on the basis of which, if they're not met, we're not going to take part. That is not how a democracy works. As I'm fond of saying, we have to deal with the world as it is as we seek to change it into the world we would wish it to be. And it cannot be, surely, that politicians from all parties and all communities in Northern Ireland are somehow unable to come together to establish the Assembly, form an executive, and get on with the task of governing. I will give way.
I'm very much enjoying the tone and the thrust of his presentation. Of course, he is dancing between a majoritarian and a power-sharing arrangement in his comments, and so they're not quite perhaps as aligned as he might suggest. But my question is this. This is not the first time that Stormont has been suspended. In the past, Sinn Féin refused to come back to the Assembly, as I understand, over concerns about the language. And the UK government has made steps towards that in more recent years. I'm just wondering then, would he support the UK government making measures towards the current impasse over the Northern Ireland Protocol as modified by the Windsor Framework? Is that a position that he could support, alterations to that, which might be helpful to restoring power and alleviating some of the concerns of the Unionist parties in Northern Ireland?
I'm grateful for that intervention, and I believe strongly in Northern Ireland's place as part of the internal market of the United Kingdom. And I've made clear repeatedly since I took up this position that I will support any measures that reinforce that, make that clear, but are also consistent with the international commitments the government has signed up to. If I could just pick it up on what he said initially, I'm not arguing at all for a majoritarian position. I'm not. I believe in power sharing. I am as wedded as the Secretary of State is to the letter and the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. I'm making a point about the responsibility of politicians to participate in that power sharing arrangement. It's the responsibility. And I would make those remarks equally to those who have collapsed the institutions previously and the current cause of the collapse, because in the end it's not in the interests of Northern Ireland not to have a functioning government. If I could clarify that. I will give way and then I will finish.
Well, because he's raising a very important point. The whole point of the agreement and of power sharing is that it is based on consent. So how can the Unionist community consent to law-making by the EU in which they do not participate and have no influence?
Very bad.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman asks a very pertinent question, but it is a consequence, if I may respond, of a course of action that personally, I didn't think it was a terribly good idea, and he thought it was. And the moment we left the European Union, everybody knew there was going to be a problem that had to be addressed. There were really, to keep that open border, there were only two practical propositions. The first was the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, the former Prime Minister, came up with a scheme to try and keep the whole of the UK within the arrangements of the single market, having announced we were leaving the single market, and that didn't work out. And the second option was to do the same in respect of Northern Ireland. So it is where we are. And the government eventually negotiated the Windsor Framework, which is an important step forward. These things are going to have to be worked through. The question is whether the operation of the Green Lane, because that is really what we're talking about. Everybody agrees with the Red Lane, if goods are coming into Northern Ireland to then head off to the Republic, well, of course they should be checked. And that's what the Red Lane is for. So what we're debating is the operation of the Green Lane. Question, does it really make sense for there to be no power-sharing government institutions, no assembly, no executive in Northern Ireland because of a debate and an argument about the operation of the Green Lane? Well, my view very strongly is that is not sufficient a reason not to have a functioning government. And I would just conclude by saying the people of Northern Ireland have been waiting long enough, and now is the time for everyone to get back to work.
Yeah. Julian Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I just want to say a few remarks in support of my right honourable friend who is moving this bill. I think it's absolutely the right thing to be doing, and I want to pay tribute to the patient work that he has done over the past few months and his officials have done. Officials here in the UK, in the Northern Ireland office, in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, and in the different political parties at Stormont. There's a huge need for this institution of Stormont to be restored, whether it is public sector pay, which has been mentioned already, whether it is health waiting lists, whether it is creaking public services, charities and others relying on public purse, or whether it's the limited offer of childcare in Northern Ireland. This institution needs to be back up and running. There's also divergence happening on medicines and other issues as a result of the fact that Stormont is not sitting. There's a really good deal on offer that the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister have put forward before Christmas. That provides over £3 billion, and it will unlock many of the challenges currently facing Northern Ireland. My right honourable friend for Lagan Valley and his team, I understand, seem to have negotiated also a very good deal with the government on issues around the Windsor Framework. And I hope in the coming days and weeks we'll be able to see the results of that work. I'm sure some within his party will still have concerns. This will not be perfect, but much better now, having moved forward and done so much work over the last few months to go back into the executive and to make the further arguments from there. For unionism generally, being in the devolved assembly is the key route to making the case for the union, for the NHS, for the fact that being in the UK defence and security system is better for Northern Ireland, and for making sure that any remaining concerns on the post-Brexit arrangements are dealt with. The Secretary of State has put the 8th of February as the end date for this bill. My understanding is that the government is supporting the final stages of the DUP negotiations. There's no bullying, there's no hard demands, there's just support for the work that my right honourable friend is doing with his party and the discussions he's having, and a real hope that in making the decision to go back into Stormont, if they do, the future for Northern Ireland, the future for young people and generations to come will be best served by this institution getting back up and running with local ministers and making decisions in the best interests of this key part of our country.
Thomson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'll begin, as is becoming sadly customary now, by saying how much a matter of regret it is that we're back here discussing a postponement to elections. Very firmly of the view that Northern Ireland is governed best when it's governed locally, and that for the sake of all the people of Northern Ireland, we wish to see the Assembly return in early course. But having said all of that, we also see no point or utility or prospect of progress being made by holding an election at this point. Now, there were opportunities last year to reflect on 25 years of devolution being in place in Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland. And I remember with great pleasure the special meeting of the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly in Belfast, where there was meetings across at Stormont itself, but also at Belfast Castle, where those who were charged with having a care for affairs and relationships between our islands and jurisdictions had the opportunity to benefit from the breadth of experience of those who were actually involved in the peace process and in the Good Friday Agreement and in establishing devolution. And to have that kind of transfusion of knowledge and experience, I certainly found as a temporary custodian of a role of somebody who is charged with having a care as being something that was incredibly valuable. And it was also a tremendous opportunity to have the opportunity to reflect on how far all parts of the UK that had been experienced devolution over that quarter century, but particularly Northern Ireland, how far they had advanced and progressed in that time. And it also brought into sharp focus and relief, I feel, how much is missed by having Stormont sitting empty at present. So I would share very much the words of the Shadow Secretary of State when he speaks about hope here, but being tempered by expectation. Now, I always very much enjoy the opportunity to visit Northern Ireland, whether in a private capacity or in my role as the SNP's spokesperson, and to take the opportunity where I can to engage with businesses and community groups and representatives of wider civic society. And I've had much cause to be grateful to elected members in Northern Ireland across varying parties for the opportunities that they've given me to do that and the doors that they've opened and the insights I've been able to gain. And I think that what has come through from many of those visits and what I observe is the sense of frustration at how politics is presently failing in Northern Ireland. And I say politics rather than politicians deliberately, because it is a failure of politics across many strands that has taken us to this point. And we saw that bubble up most obviously in the recent strikes. Now, I highlighted in the budget debates that we had in this place, in the Northern Ireland budget, about the problems that are caused and the potential solutions that are deferred by civil servants having to try and cheese-pair to set budgets within the confines of the ghosts of ministerial decisions past. Now, I remember from my time in local government the frustration that you would get from council officers if you were unable to provide any kind of clear political direction on what it was you actually wanted to happen. And while it was always possible under different circumstances to set balanced budgets, how much better it was to be able to set them in the context of having some clear political leadership about the choices you wish to make with the resources at your disposal. So that is certainly a consideration here. It is impossible to set the kind of strategic budget directions that are needed in Northern Ireland right now, absent a working institution at Stormont. Now, when it comes to public sector pay, the Secretary of State says that using part of the £3.3 billion cash allocation to settle these claims ahead of Stormont being reconstituted would be it's a political decision and therefore not one that he is willing to make. Now, I would just say, as gently as I can, that taking a decision not to act is also taking a political decision in its own way. So the decision not to act is also political. And I would join with other voices in this place that we have heard and that we in this debate, previous debates, and as I'm sure we will hear later, to urge the Secretary of State to reconsider his stance on that, because public sector workers in Northern Ireland, the brunt of whom the pressures that are being caused are falling on really do deserve the pay settlements that their counterparts elsewhere in these islands have been able to get. And I will just mention in passing that the levelling up funding, it was said that the absence of a functioning Stormont was the reason why the UK government was unwilling to progress with making funding and levelling up. That caused us to have a wry chuckle to myself, given the UK government's disinclination to work with the devolved governments that are up and running in Scotland and Wales. So I think there's a certain amount of cherry picking going on there with the excuses that are being offered. So punishing the people of Northern Ireland to try to bring to bear some additional political leverage on politicians has not been a conspicuous success so far, and nor do I believe it's an appropriate lever to try and continue to use where public sector pay is concerned. Now, as I say, this was a failure of politics, and the fundamental problem that has led us to where we are stems from Brexit and the manner in which successive governments chose to take that forward, lest we forget, against the express wishes of clear majorities both in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. Again, I allowed myself a wry smile that during debates about the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, we were told about the trade border we'd apparently be creating with the rest of the UK, only then 2 years later to see the UK government going hell for leather towards creating a trade border within itself between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, I do remember a backbench business debate about the Northern Ireland Protocol, and I very much enjoyed causing some consternation on the opposite side of the chamber by pointing out, maybe a little bit indelicately, that if Scotland were once again independent and in the European Union, would be able to enjoy free trade with Northern Ireland as a way that neither of us can currently enjoy as part of the Union, based on the deals that have been put in place. So I'm very, very clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, in closing, where my preferences are for the constitutional future of these islands are in that regard. But short of that, bringing the UK back into the single market and the customs union would make this go away. But accepting that that is not politically realistic, given the stance of the current government or the aspiring government, what I would say is that having closer alignment on sanitary and phytosanitary matters especially would be of enormous benefit, not just to people in Northern Ireland, but also right across these islands, and particularly for my own constituents, speaking selfishly for those involved in the agriculture and food trade. Bringing that closer alignment is a much better thing to do, because the closer we're able to come into alignment, the lesser, I believe, these issues become, and that is something that would be manifestly in the interests of all of these islands, whatever constitutional future we all go on to choose in future. Thank you.
Sir Robert Buckland.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Gentleman for Gordon. I was listening very carefully to his assertions about Scotland, an independent Scotland, being a member of the European Union. I'm not sure that assumption is actually the right one to make, bearing in mind the view of some other member states of that union, notably Spain, which I think make a reality check to some of the loftier rhetoric of the SNP about their position in Europe and the world should they choose to separate from the rest of the United Kingdom. I make that point because I think it was inevitable that the consequences of Brexit meant that an arrangement with regard to the hard border, or the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, was always going to be a difficult one. I certainly bear the scars on my back, having been involved as a law officer right through that process, and indeed helping to put together the Malthouse Compromise. Anybody remember that? Back in the early part of 2018. I know colleagues from the DUP will remember that time very well indeed. And we tried to work together to get somewhere which would satisfy everybody. Now, as the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Leeds Central said, we have to work in the world as it is, not as the world that we would like it to be. And in these current circumstances, Mr Deputy Speaker, it does seem to me that one way that we can actually find out about aspects of the operation of the Windsor Framework is for the Executive to be able to carry that out and to see its operation, to see how the Green Lane works. And if there are operational problems, then let's deal with them. Because I'm as anxious as anybody to make sure that businesses and individuals and everybody who wants to trade in Northern Ireland and through Northern Ireland is able to do so in as free and uninhibited a way as possible. I don't want to see Northern Ireland being cast adrift from the rest of our United Kingdom in that way at all. And I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Or Gavin way, and he makes reference to Northern Ireland being set adrift from the rest of the United Kingdom. Businesses in the United Kingdom are finding it difficult and bureaucratically difficult to trade with Northern Ireland. As a consequence, the divergence of trade is continuing day and daily and is increasing as we go. That's why everyone says, oh, the Republic of Ireland is booming. That's simply because their supply chain has changed as well. They're no longer coming through the UK, they're getting it straight from France. But one point that I want to find out, can you tell me what engagement has the British government had with the EU in relation to changes that we need to be made to the Windsor Framework and to the protocol to work?
The Honourable Gentleman, obviously my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, will answer about any engagement that the UK government has had with Brussels, and he's right to cast it at that level because it is a matter between that government and the EU, bearing in mind the Republic's membership of the EU and the fact that the EU has the competence to negotiate a treaty. But it is only barely a year since the Windsor Framework was agreed. I think in all reality, again, coming back to the world as it is, I think it would be wrong of us here to blithely assume that somehow that can be reopened here and now. I'm not saying it can never be reopened. Of course everything can be reopened. Indeed, there will be an opportunity in a few years to look at the whole trade agreement that we reached with the EU and in the review period in 25-26. But the point I'm making, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that unless we see a functioning executive being able to and as it will have responsibility for the operational aspects of Windsor, to identify the problems, to highlight them, to raise them with the UK government and indeed at an appropriate level, then I don't think we're going to move this process on in the way that I know honourable and right honourable members opposite want to see happen, as do I. I've said it many times that the UK Internal Markets Act that we debated long and hard back in 2020 when I was Lord Chancellor contained some measures in it that have been helpful and are now on the statute book, but there was more that I think in that bill, putting aside the notwithstanding clause, there was more that was intended to be done legislatively to help cement the place of Northern Ireland in our UK internal market. And I think we should do it. And I think we should legislate. I know the member for my honourable friend, the member for Belfast East, very much agrees with me on this point. We want to see that, and I want to see that happen. But we're here in January 2024. I note the shortness of the period that the Secretary of State seeks to extend for the purposes of this Act. I think that is sensible and right. I think, tempting as it is to have longer periods, I'm not going to call them blank cheques, but longer periods, I don't think that would be right. And I wish him well, and I wish everybody in the negotiations well in coming to a sensible and pragmatic solution that allows the Government of Northern Ireland to continue. I'm not going to repeat the points made by honourable and right honourable members, Mr Deputy Speaker. I see it in the committee that I chair weekly. We still have that inability to plan ahead, or the institutions of Northern Ireland have that inability to plan ahead in a multi-year way to provide the level of public service that I know they want to do, but which they just cannot, bearing in mind the constraints that we have to operate under. And unlike previous periods of direct rule, this time there would need to be legislative change here on the floor of this House for that to happen. And I think it's been made very clear by the leaderships in both the main parties that that is not the policy of the British government. Now that's the world as it is, I'm afraid, not as the world as necessary some would like it to be. And I certainly do not want to see a situation where there is an imbalance again within our UK constitution that will only lead to more tension being stoked within the communities of Northern Ireland rather than less. And therefore it seems to me that the most, and I will give way in a moment, the most obvious way forward now does have to be the restoration
of the executive. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. There's been much use of this phrase, the world as it is, in this debate so far. I think it is actually helpful. We must be pragmatic about it. And I just wonder whether it's the intention of his committee and their work to include looking at Northern Ireland as it is now, for example, levels of inward investment, or how business has responded to that 12 months in which the Windsor framework has been in place.
I'm very grateful to him. We are in the process of preparing a report on the state of public services in Northern Ireland. We've taken a wealth of evidence, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for Strangford and the Honourable Lady the Member for Upper Bann, who are active members of the committee. They will have heard the same evidence that we have heard. We are looking into the energy market and indeed the move to net zero in Northern Ireland, very important issue, bearing in mind hard-pressed bill payers and the particular pressures that they are under, bearing in mind the way in which energy is supplied. And of course we're looking at issues as varied as education right through to paramilitarism. I think it's right when it comes, I will give way in a moment, but I think it's right when it comes to Windsor that I think I sound a bit like Chow in Lai, in that in some respects it is still too early to say precisely what its effects are, but there's no doubt that as the Honourable Gentleman from South Antrim has said, I'm sure he's going to intervene again, there is already evidence of excessive bureaucracy and problems that are real for businesses on the ground. And I'll give way to him again.
Because Northern Ireland sits under EU rules and laws, the carbon tax offset for energy costs is twice what it is in the rest of the United Kingdom, and that's simply because we are having to take on board European law as opposed to what is passed in this House.
And again, the Honourable Gentleman is right to point out some of the facts here about the position that we find ourselves in. But I'm not going to labour the point. I'm afraid the consequences of Brexit are always going to be complex and difficult for Northern Ireland, bearing in mind the particular importance of the border and the clash, if you like, between the irresistible force of the logic of a single market that wishes to police its border very rigidly and the immovable object of the fact that the border has a particular status and a sensitivity that means that to make it excessively hard creates other problems and other issues that we are all very familiar with. That, I'm afraid, is the difficulty that we have to wrestle with, all of us. And I know that this place sometimes risks sounding rather portentous and nannyish in the way it talks about Northern Ireland. We have to be very careful about that. But what I'm saying is that in resisting that approach, it is absolutely logically correct to say that the best way to cure this issue is for the institutions of Stormont to function now. And I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
Would my right honourable friend have a message for the Unionist community in Northern Ireland as to why they should put up with EU laws they do not influence and why they should put up with border controls when they're trading within our own country?
My message to them is simply that the message I would give is that we still need a functioning executive to work out and to bring to account in proper scrutiny issues with the framework, so that at a Stormont level it can be absolutely understood, debated in far more detail than the time and the capacity we have in this House, and for that work to be done thoroughly by the institutions of Stormont, so that this place is even better informed, and the government in particular is even better informed about what it needs to do to correct some of the problems that have been thrown up by the anomalous position that Northern Ireland finds itself in. That is, I think, now where we stand. We have to get on with exercising these institutions in order to actually solve some of the problems that honourable and right honourable members quite rightly raise. Before I finish, I will simply say this. I commend the right honourable gentleman, the member for Lagan Valley, for his forbearance, his patience, and the way in which he is approaching these issues. I do commend him. It is not an easy position for anybody to be in. All of us will have to make compromises in our political life. Goodness knows that's been something I've had to wrestle with. And I simply say, on behalf of the committee I have the honour of chairing, that he goes with all the goodwill and support
that I can muster on behalf of the committee that I chair. And I do hope that 2024 will be a moment not of more pause, not of more political vacuum, but a moment when responsibility can be taken up, the reins of government can be held firmly by my friends in the DUP, and that we can see progress for the people of Northern Ireland that I know everybody wants to see. Thank you.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Right Honourable Member for South Swindon for his comments and wish him well in his ongoing work as Chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, a very important work that it is. And I do want to say also to the Honourable Member for St Helens North, who is not in his place, that of course we recognise that with the pressures on our public services at this time, we want to get to a place where we will see our political institutions restored on a sustainable basis. And as the Shadow Secretary of State reminded us, on a basis that Unionists as well as Nationalists can support. Because that principle of cross-community consensus is at the heart of the Belfast and successor agreements. And it is the key element and principle that enables those institutions to operate in what remains a divided society in Northern Ireland. To be absolutely clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Democratic Unionist Party supports the devolution. We support the concept of the people of Northern Ireland being able to elect their representatives and to have good government delivered through those institutions, the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Northern Ireland Executive. And so we are very clear that our objective is twofold. Firstly, to address the issues and the problems created by the Northern Ireland Protocol as part of the withdrawal agreement of 2019-2020 and provide the basis for the restoration of our political institutions. We are approaching the 2-year mark now since my party took the decision to withdraw the First Minister, and that then precipitated a process that ultimately resulted in the institutions not being able to function. That was not a decision we took lightly. And for months in advance of that decision, I made clear, my party made clear, we wanted to see a negotiating process underway between the Government of the United Kingdom and the European Union to address the very real problems created by the protocol. And sadly, those pleas were ignored. And there was no process. In fact, we were told variously by Irish government ministers, EU representatives, and so on, that the protocol would not be renegotiated. So I stand today and I recognise that as a result of the actions my party has taken, the EU were brought back to the table. There were negotiations. Changes have occurred. And further change will come as a result of our actions. You know, as I watch the political discourse back home in Northern Ireland and I listen to the commentary of some who share our concerns about the protocol and its impact on Northern Ireland, but who at this moment in time are talking up that some deal has been done, that clearly they think they know the detail, and that it falls short of what they need or require. But I will say this, Mr Deputy Speaker. My party can stand over its record of the change we have delivered and will deliver. And I say to those who point the finger at us, what have you delivered? What has the traditional Unionist Voice party delivered by way of change to the protocol? Absolutely nothing. Not a single thing. Nothing. And yet they put up posters in the dark of the night before any deal has been done, talking about a sellout. Well, what have they sold? What have they delivered for the people of Northern Ireland? What has been their contribution to securing the change that we need to restore our place in the United Kingdom and its internal market? And we read lots of other pearls of wisdom on social media about what is needed, what is required. And we hear all kinds of speculation from the commentators about what has been agreed, despite the fact they haven't seen the detail. And there is undoubtedly an attempt to orchestrate opposition to a deal that has not yet taken place, an agreement that is not yet concluded. And the very fact that we're sat here today in this House of Commons extending legislation reflects the fact, the reality, that no agreement has yet been reached. If it were, we wouldn't be here. And yet, there are some who, for their own narrow purposes, are putting it about that certain things have been agreed, that it's all there, and they know what it is. They are entitled to their view. Everyone is entitled to their perspective. But I say this: wait until an agreement is reached before you make your final verdict. Assess the progress that has been made before you reach your conclusion. But I suspect what is going on is not about that. The truth is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are some, a tiny minority, but there are some who don't want Stormont back, who don't want an assembly in Northern Ireland, who, and I quote, would rather have imperfect direct rule than an imperfect Stormont. That is what they say. And yet they're the same people who berate the government of the United Kingdom and this Parliament for selling them out constantly, who constantly point the finger at the United Kingdom government and say, you've sold us short, you've betrayed us, you've let us down, and yet they want to hand all the power back to that government. That is not the view of the vast majority of Unionists or people in Northern Ireland. And we understand that, which is why we are committed to getting a solution, to moving things forward, to making progress, to resolving the issues that have harmed Northern Ireland, our economy, our businesses, and yes, our place in the United Kingdom. I am a proud Unionist. I am proud to be part of this United Kingdom. I am proud to have served my country in this Parliament for almost 27 years. I'm proud of the service that I've given, unlike some others, to my country when I put on the uniform of the Ulster Defence Regiment to protect everyone in the community from terrorism and violence. And yet today, because of the stirring up that is going on, I was threatened. Threatened by those who never put on a uniform, by those who haven't served our country. And when I checked out, one of the people who threatened me on the register didn't vote at the last election. Can't even come out to vote for our future in the Union, never mind do anything about it. And yet they're threatening people like me, who's working day and night to try and find solutions and to move Northern Ireland forward on a basis that the vast majority of people can support. Well, I will just say this to those who stir up and those who threaten. The Provisional IRA attacked me in the past, and it didn't deflect me from the task that I have and my colleagues have to do our job and to get the best that we can for Northern Ireland. And I will not be deflected now. I will continue on the course. I will continue to engage with the government until we get the progress that is needed to enable us to take a decision about whether it is sufficient to restore the political institutions. And let's not forget, when we took the decision to come out of the institutions, it was about the protocol. It's about restoring Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom and its internal market. It's about ensuring that when goods are flowing from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and staying within the United Kingdom, they flow freely. It is about ensuring that our place in the economic union is respected and protected in law. And it's about ensuring that our place in the political union is respected and protected in law. That is important. That is what we are striving to achieve, to ensure that in terms of Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom, it is valued, it is respected, and it is protected. That our right to trade within our own country is respected and protected. That is what we are aiming to achieve. But I make no apology, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we're also aiming to strengthen our ties across this United Kingdom. Devolution in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland has altered the way that we govern in this nation. Brexit, our decision to leave the European Union, has altered things. And that is why, as part of what we are proposing, we want to see a more joined up, a more cohesive approach across the Union, working together on economic issues, trade issues, education, health, that we are joined up on those matters. So we're working to make progress on this. I also want to say something else, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that I find quite insulting. When the Secretary of State convened talks at Hillsborough to discuss the funding of our public services in Northern Ireland, I didn't ask the Secretary of State to do that. I am very clear. For me, this is not about the money. This is about Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. And when we've made the progress that I hope we will make, we will sit down with the government and we will finalise arrangements in relation to the future sustainability of our political institutions, the funding of our public services. But I do want to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to echo the comments that have been made by other colleagues in the House this afternoon. Our public services are only as effective as the people who work in them. And we saw during the COVID pandemic our healthcare workers on the front line working hard, our doctors, our nurses, our ancillary staff, our care workers, all working, taking risks, putting themselves on the line. In education, our teachers investing in the future of our young people, and many others who work across our public services in Northern Ireland. They deserve their pay rise. They have earned their pay rise. It is essential to the delivery of our public services that they get their pay rise. And I hope that the Secretary of State, in advance of reaching an agreement, whenever that might be, on the outstanding issues, which I believe we are moving towards finalising those outstanding issues, then I would hope the Secretary of State for 2023-24 will transfer the funding that the Treasury have committed to and enable our public sector workers to have the pay rise that they deserve. We do not want to see politics played with them, and I urge the government to do that. And today I noted that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, Northern Ireland, have come out with yet another statement calling on the Secretary of State to act, and I echo their comments. They deserve the pay rise, and I do hope the Secretary of State will reflect upon this. So in conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, some have said that they hope this is the last time that we have this type of legislation. But that requires us to reach agreement. It requires us to resolve and finalise the outstanding issues so that we can move forward. We can assess the progress that has been made, and we can take decisions around the restoration of our political institutions if that is the way we are to go. But I am clear, my colleagues are clear. This is not about any price. We have fought hard and will continue to fight hard to get the outcomes that we need for everyone in Northern Ireland, to restore that cross-community consensus that is essential for the proper functioning of our devolved institutions in Northern Ireland. We will work at that. And I simply say to my fellow Unionists in Northern Ireland, whatever their political persuasion or background, the notion that a unionism that turns in on itself is a unionism that can deliver for Northern Ireland, to make Northern Ireland work, to secure the union for the future, is not the way to go. It is not the way to go. We will provide the leadership that is required, because that is what is necessary to make Northern Ireland work, to ensure that our place in the Union is valued, is respected and protected in law and in practice, to remove the barriers to trade that enable us to trade in both directions with the rest of the United Kingdom, to ensure that our Union is stronger and that Northern Ireland's place within it is both respected and protected. That's what we're aiming to achieve. We will assess the outcome against our 7 tests that we have set out very clearly, determine the progress that's been made, and make our decisions based upon these matters. We will do so rationally and clearly recognising that we are the custodians of Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom. On our shoulders rests a huge responsibility. Mr Deputy Speaker, we will not shirk that responsibility, and we will not be found wanting in continuing to defend Northern Ireland's place in the Union.
Stephen Farry.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I probably won't do the Right Honourable Member for Lagan very much favours, but can I congratulate him on the tone of his speech and say that I did find it to be encouraging in that respect. Obviously, Northern Ireland at present is in an incredibly difficult place, and in terms of the overall situation we find ourselves in, it is fair to say that there is disappointment, anger, frustration and indeed bewilderment that we don't have functioning institutions. That is a view that's shared by the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland and indeed by businesses and civic society organisations. When the January 24 date was set for the outgoing bill, it seemed to be so far off into the future that it seemed to be inconceivable that the institutions wouldn't be restored by that point. But here we are. It is, in a sense, bizarre to see a piece of primary legislation going through this Parliament to essentially extend and facilitate a negotiation by 2 weeks. And I do have to say that decisions could have been taken at any stage in the previous year and indeed the previous weeks and indeed days to avoid this situation. On the surface, this is a very simple bill, but beneath it lies a much bigger story. So this may well be a pragmatic extension in the hope and expectation of a breakthrough, and can I sincerely say that I do hope that that is very much the case. But the people of Northern Ireland have been patient and overly patient in many respects in terms of seeing this brought to a conclusion, and I have to say there will always be that degree of scepticism until we see that positive outcome. However, for others, this will amount to potentially kicking the can down the road for another couple of weeks and potentially deferring what will be much bigger decisions that have to be taken in the event that we don't see that speedy resumption of devolution. One aspect of this situation we find ourselves in is the story of Brexit itself, which has been alluded to by both of the opposition front benches, which is how the DUP backed a hard Brexit and didn't reconcile that with the implications for Northern Ireland in terms of special arrangements that had to be put in place. And there is no perfect solution to the challenges that Brexit poses to Northern Ireland. The Windsor Framework, I think, does perhaps offer the best approach to putting a square peg into a round hole, short of a wider reassessment of the overall UK relationship with the European Union. But I have to stress that whatever the residual issues that exist in terms of the Windsor Framework, and I do fully accept that businesses have frustrations with certain aspects of what they are seeing, and the same applies for consumers in some respects. All of those pale into insignificance from the absence of not having functioning institutions and the ability to take decisions around health, education, our economy and protecting our environment. And we are seeing real consequences as well, again, which has been touched upon by the chair of the committee, in terms of wider trust and confidence in politics itself. In Northern Ireland, politics isn't working, and that's a very dangerous place to find ourselves in. And it's not simply a case that issues are being parked for the eventual resumption of the Assembly to pick up where we left off. Every day this impasse goes on, more and more damage is being done to Northern Ireland's public services, and we're losing economic opportunities. I don't want to get into too much politics today. There's been a lot of that, but I do nevertheless have a responsibility to say that there are other options that we have to consider in this respect. The DUP have been allowed to essentially hold the process to ransom with impunity over the past 12 months in terms of blocking the executive. And while I understand the point about cross-community confidence in any executive, what we're seeing in terms of the blocking of the functioning of an executive, it actually goes against 75% of the people of Northern Ireland. And there's a world of difference between checks and balances around individual decision-making within the institutions and a party putting them down and stopping them from functioning whatsoever and having no government at all. And the fact that we have to legislate for direct rule in the event that that is indeed where we end up, and I stress again that I hope we don't find ourselves in that situation, shows that previous legislators didn't envisage a situation in which the Assembly would not be functioning. The space for negotiations around the Windsor Framework are, of course, narrow. We have to be realistic that the Windsor Framework is an agreement between the UK and the European Union, and there will be consequences from unpicking that or doing so unilaterally. Equally, we can't unpick the Good Friday Agreement. So the space within that is narrow and essentially is around implementation. But I do want to again stress, from my own party's point of view, that we will be open-minded in terms of any solution that comes forward in this respect. For us, the key element is that Northern Ireland maintains the dual market access to both the UK internal market and to the wider European market. Outside of that red line, we are open-minded. If checks across the Irish Sea can be reduced or eliminated in some cases, we're all for that. None of us want to see those. But at the same time, we recognise that due to the fact that Northern Ireland does have those special arrangements, and there's a good reason for that, that there may well need to be some degree of checks across the Irish Sea. And Northern Ireland's always had those throughout its entire history, right back to the foundation of the state in the early 1920s. And they were accepted with pragmatism for very good reasons, and I would certainly urge that is the case today. I also want to touch upon the financial package that the Secretary of State has referred to, and again put on record my party's thanks to him and his wider team in the Northern Ireland office, and also the Treasury for putting that together. This is a bigger financial package than we have seen in terms of previous breakdowns of the devolution. But I have to say at the same time, it is somewhat of a glass half full. This will buy some time for a restored executive for perhaps a couple of years in terms of stabilisation, but there's still a much bigger conversation that we have to have in conjunction potentially with the next spending review around a proper fiscal floor for Northern Ireland. I appreciate that there's reasons why this current government can't go down that particular avenue in terms of their wider spending commitments and the Prime Minister's five commitments. But I think it's important that we do stress that point, that there's still that wider discussion that does need to take place. Again, I would join with colleagues from Northern Ireland in stressing that we would like to see the Secretary of State moving ahead with the public sector pay issue. This isn't something that's having any leverage whatsoever in terms of the negotiations. The money is there, the money should be released. But equally, we have to be frank as well, that while we all may wish to dump on the Secretary of State and put pressure on him, and he is a player in this regard, I have to say to my colleagues beneath me that equally, if they return to the Executive tomorrow or in the next week or whatever, that is actually going to be still a quicker and smoother way of releasing those resources. So there's two ways in which we can address the rightful claims of public sector workers, either through the action of the Secretary of State or a speedy resumption of devolution. In the event that we don't see an outcome in the next couple of weeks, we do have to look at other alternatives. Perhaps those are a debate for another day, but there are two directions of travel. And for me and my party, reform is the key way forward. The Good Friday Agreement was never meant to be set in stone. It was always envisaged that it would evolve with circumstances and changing demographics. Indeed, many of the architects of the agreement, people no less than Senator George Mitchell himself, have recognised that review and evolution would be important. So reform either is important to facilitate restoration, or if we get restoration, to learn the lessons of instability, lack of cohesion, unfairness over the past 25 years, and to prevent a further collapse from happening. But the principles of the agreement remain sound, structures remain sound, that set of relationships across these islands, they remain sound. And perhaps I would conclude with this point. I think it was the Shadow Secretary of State made the point that all the parties in Northern Ireland are committed to devolution. Reform of the agreement keeps devolution alive. If we end up with what is the presumed default of going for direct rule, we're moving outside of the Good Friday Agreement. It may well be the pragmatic solution in the circumstances that we find ourselves in, because Northern Ireland has to be governed and public services have to be funded. But nonetheless, we have to recognise that is a big step away from devolution. So reform is consistent with the agreement, direct rule isn't. However, and I think it's a point to stress to those people who are again opposing a deal and the way forward. In the event that we don't get restoration and we end up with direct rule, that direct rule will have to have an Irish dimension to it. Now, that Irish dimension will be consultative. It will build upon existing structures within the agreement. We have to recognise that direct rule, in terms of a divided, diverse Northern Ireland, will be controversial, and they have to recognise that in terms of our governance and put in place mechanisms that balance that out.
Accept the constitutional
that is the reality, and I say to my colleague from Northern Ireland who's muttering from a secondary place, and I'm happy to take intervention from him on this point, that the principle of consent remains in place. However, the principle of an Irish dimension has been established for quite some time, going back to the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Of course, the Good Friday Agreement acted to take much of that away, but that is the direction of travel. And for those people who are arguing against progress in Northern Ireland and saying we have a comfort blanket of direct rule to fall back upon, they need to think very carefully about what they're actually calling for, because what I'm setting out is not what I want to see. It's not definitely what they want to see, but that is the trajectory that they will find themselves on if we don't see a speedy restoration of Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Colum Eastwood.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by saying the Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley and I haven't agreed on very much recently. In fact, it kind of drives me crazy. And we don't agree on much of what we've debated today over the past couple of years. But I do strongly believe that he comes at this from a position of strong belief. He comes at it in an attempt to represent his constituents. He comes at it from a good place. It's a different place than me, and we want to end up in a different place. And maybe I would argue he's helping us along in that regard. But I do say this very clearly. Those people who have threatened him today couldn't lace his boots. And every single Democrat in this House or elsewhere should stand in solidarity with any of us who are being attacked like that. I think we are in a more hopeful place than we have been today. I was expecting last week to come and have to debate a much wider piece of legislation that would have seen us going in a different direction. If this today symbolises that we're getting closer, at least, to a resolution, then I think we have to welcome it. and we have to give it space. There is nobody more frustrated than me at the slowness of this process. There is nobody, I think, who has expressed frustration more than me about how we've got into this situation. Of course, it's nearly 2 years now since we've had a government in Northern Ireland. Just before that, we had COVID, which is a very strange time. And before that, we had 3.5 years after Sinn Féin brought the government down of having no government. People in Northern Ireland now feel like the default setting is to have no government. That just isn't good enough. And any of us in this place who really believes in devolution, who've really put their shoulder to the wheel around this peace process, need to ensure that we can very soon have democratically elected politicians in Northern Ireland dealing with these issues. Because I do find it, frankly, embarrassing at the state of our health service. I was reading some figures the other day about dementia diagnoses. Some people in the western part of Northern Ireland are waiting almost 6 years to get diagnosed with dementia. In what modern democracy should that be seen as acceptable? I mean, we are very lucky that people aren't on the streets in uproar at those kind of figures. The public sector is being tied together by a string. Our health service is at the point, if not beyond the point, of collapse. And it isn't the fault of those people who've been asked to go into the tough places, do the tough work for very little pay. And we had an amendment to this bill, and we understand the bill is very narrow in scope today, calling on the Secretary of State to pay those workers. There were 175,000 people in the cold and the snow on picket lines last week across Northern Ireland. Now, I think people will know my preference is that the DUP go back into government as soon as possible, that we have democratically elected people making those decisions and we get that money into people's pockets. But I am absolutely furious that those ordinary workers have been used as a political pawn because of our political failure. It is absolutely unacceptable. Those people need their pay rise today. They're the people holding this thing together. They're the people who we've asked to go and do the tough things for very little reward. There is no excuse anymore for that money not getting paid. And if there's a technical reason for it, I'll come back tomorrow and we can debate a budget bill if the Secretary of State wants about getting money into those people's pockets. There is no technical reason as to why those people cannot get paid. We have talked about solutions. We've got lots of solutions, and I noticed that the member for North Down talks about reform. We're up for that conversation about reform. In fact, we had an amendment today that would have got, I think, the Assembly back up and running again if we used a different mechanism for electing the Speaker as at least a first point. We also understand that we have to get a proper reformed institutions at Stormont. But my strong view is the best way to have that conversation is whilst we have a government and an executive in Stormont, because I do fear that we would end up in a 5-year negotiation about what reform would look like, and all the while we still wouldn't have a government in Stormont, locally elected people dealing with the people's concerns. Some of us in this chamber have been through many long negotiations and know you can go into a negotiation wanting to fix one little thing. 5 years later, you haven't fixed that thing and you've done 3 or 4 different things that nobody asked for in the first place. So I think we need to be cautious about that. We need to be committed to reform. But the first thing that has to happen is the people who were elected to represent people in Northern Ireland, the First Minister who was elected to be the First Minister, they should be in place. They should be allowed to do the job that they're elected to do. And then we can have a proper discussion about how we reform our institutions. Because a blind man on a galloping horse could tell you we have to reform those institutions because, frankly, they're not working. And I would make one plea today to all other political parties, and I'll make the commitment myself, that the next time, if we do get Stormont back up and running, the next time that a particular political party has a major disagreement, can we have a discussion about that, and can we all commit not to pulling the institutions down? The edifice of government should not be the first thing that goes when we have a difficult decision to make, and I think that would take us a long way. Look, I'm glad that we've come to this point. I think it tells us something about the direction of travel. I think the history of our place should remind us all that at some point we always have to take on our own dissidents, whether within our own party, in our own community, on social media, or wherever they reside. But they need to be taken on, because the broad swathe of opinion, whether they're nationalist or unionist or not interested, want ordinary people to be looked after. They want their health service properly resourced. They want their schools properly functioning. They want their public sector workers paid properly. The broad population want a government in Stormont, and they want it now.
Order. Before I proceed, I remind honourable members that this debate, the second reading debate, has to end at 3:23. I assume that honourable members will want to hear the front benches wind up. I'm not going to put a time limit on it, but it's up to honourable members whether they choose to hear the front benches or not. Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and without encroaching upon the advice you've just given, am I right to assume that there are 3 backbenchers still waiting to address? Because I think we can parse the time well between us if that is the case. I think it's 3. I'm not sure if I'm wrong on that.
As things stand, yes, but one honourable member left the chamber and came back in. Another honourable member who indicated that she wished to speak has left the chamber but is entitled to come back in because she heard the opening speeches, as did the honourable gentleman's colleague. So all I'm saying is I urge brevity upon you. I know that's difficult. At the moment, speeches are running at more than 10 minutes. That's too long.
Very grateful, Mr Deputy Speaker, for that, and I certainly do not take those comments personally, because it's a trait that we have amongst us of Ulster Scots lineage that we can sometimes add a few extra words or phrases. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to follow on in this debate, and I want to acknowledge the constructive tone from the honourable member for Foyle. I think he is right to say that should we find ourselves in circumstances like this in the future, then yes, we should talk. And if I wasn't willing to follow the constructive tone of this debate, then I would gently remind him that at a time when we tried to have those conversations, there were some chiding us and encouraging us to take the action that we did, mocking us for not doing that, but I'll leave it there. I am proud also to follow in the remarks from my party leader, our party leader, the leader of Unionism, and the right honourable member for Lagan Valley, who has very carefully and clearly and thoughtfully articulated not just where we have been, where we are today, but the aspiration that we have outlined for the last number of years, that we have been to the electorate, that we have highlighted the difficulties and the deficits within arrangements foisted upon us, but the challenge for us all to recognise that the prize for restoring Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom in reducing the constitutional harm, removing the democratic deficit, the prize of doing all of that allows us to get back to the place where Northern Ireland functions as well as it has in the past, in a way in which people within Northern Ireland are confident of their place within this United Kingdom, irrespective of their constitutional outlook. A place where people in Northern Ireland can recognise that it is through their elected representatives, directly and locally, that they can shape their own future. It doesn't matter what passport they hold, they live in Northern Ireland and can benefit from, and do benefit from, the relationship that has spanned for centuries on these islands. And so when he refers to custodians of the future, and I remind people that our place in politics is to protect and promote our place within this United Kingdom. That is our first and foremost principle. And so for individuals who have in the last number of days, and will no doubt continue in the next number of days, to raise questions or sow discord, let me say this: the Democratic Unionist Party are united in the task we have before us. We highlighted the pitfalls and the dangers of what was proposed to us back in 2019 at a time when others dismissed and demeaned our position. When we asked for change and indicated the consequences it could have for power sharing arrangements in devolution, we were dismissed. We were set aside. Yet through our actions, when changes were delivered in the Windsor framework, what we were told were mythical unicorns suddenly became something far from rigorous implementation, but changes which recognised the problems and brought solutions. And the very same people who ridiculed and dismissed at that stage turned round and said, well, of course, this is all sensible, this is pragmatic, and we should move forward. When faced with the choice between religious observance on that which was agreed with the European Union or the importance of devolution, sadly there are those within Northern Ireland political society that chose religious observance with the EU. They lost sight of the prize of power sharing in Northern Ireland, where communities of different aspirations could work collectively together. That's where we find ourselves, Deputy Speaker. And the Secretary of State and I have been engaged, as he has with a number of colleagues, over a considerable period of time. And I commend him for a number of things, but in delivering a speech which had fewer words than the bill before us today, I think was a remarkable achievement. But he didn't have many choices that were workable other than to present the bill today. Of course, he could have brought forward legislation that would have addressed a budget for next year. He could have brought forward legislation that assumed powers from Stormont to here in Westminster. And he could have brought forward legislation that would have set a regional rate of around 15%. And I think it's fair in the context of this debate to recognise that he may still need to bring forward such legislation. But whilst others speculate about the intention of this short bill, and I have my own views on it and what it should have been, I think it's a recognition that there is still work to be done and a recognition that there is a commitment to do that work. And I can't say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, where it will end. I know where I think it should end. I can't say what the ultimate outcome will be. But what I see and read and hear in papers at home bears no resemblance to reality. We are at one in our position. We have stood together through worse times than this. Anybody who thinks they're going to come at one member of our party over the coming days and weeks comes at us all. Comes at us all. And comes at us all for their nefarious ends, not our collective future. And the choices will become stark. But let's make a choice on the basis of where we are, not where others who don't wish anything to work think it is. That's a challenge for us, Mr. Deputy Speaker. That's a challenge for the people of Northern Ireland. That's a challenge for the people that we represent. There is nothing in standing in the position that I do today, 9 years as an elected representative in this House, 14 years as an elected representative, somebody who's lived in Northern Ireland benefiting longer from periods of peace than of troubled times. There is nothing that will shake our resolve to get this right. And I say that only with this in mind, that the Secretary of State has taken the choice available to him today in proceeding with this bill, and it does not end today. It cannot end today, and our commitment for the future needs to be emboldened further still.
Yeah. Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm not too sure why we have the bill in its form today that we have, and the suggestion we could have further legislation on the 8th of February. I suppose the generous interpretation of this is that the government still recognises that there's a lot of work which needs to be done in order to have the concerns of the Unionist population dealt with. The other interpretation is that this is an attempt to put short-term pressure on the party which I belong to come to an agreement on the basis of terms which are unacceptable. I've got to say the record of the government, I know the government is intent on trying to put the failure of its negotiations with the EU behind it, because it's got so much internal division within its own party about how it has not and how it has failed to deliver on the promises of Brexit. But Northern Ireland cementing this agreement into the constitutional position of Northern Ireland is not good for a government which claims it wanted to take back sovereignty, and is not acceptable to Unionists in Northern Ireland who have gone through terrorist campaigns and shown resolve in terrorist campaigns to stay within the United Kingdom. And we have had all of the kinds of pressures put on us. We have had the threats. We've even heard some more of those threats today about if you don't go down the route of getting a resolution here, then we will have to re-examine the Belfast Agreement. We'll have to maybe take away the safeguards that there were, because, of course, with Unionists now not being the dominant parties in the Assembly, it's very easy for those who said safeguards for minorities were important in the agreement, but now just to dismiss them. And I must say, I listened to the member for North Down. It's little wonder that many people in North Down regard him now as a Sinn Féin cuckoo in the constituency nest in North Down, because he talks so much and argues so many times like he was coming from a Sinn Féin position rather than from the position of a constituency which is predominantly Unionist. But we've had the threats. Oh, there might be a change in the agreement. Take away the consensus. We might have direct rule that involves the Irish Republic, even though there's no provision for that in the Good Friday Agreement. And of course, the Secretary of State has sought in times, or through surrogates. I know what the chairman, the member for North Down, echoes the words of the chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee in threatening that there could be big change which is detrimental to the Union if we don't come to an agreement quickly. We've had the bribes. And of course, we have also had the bullying. If you don't go back into the Assembly, then people are not going to get their pay rise and everything else. And I've got to say, Secretary of State, it does not become the current government to use the workers in Northern Ireland as pawns in trying to push us into a situation which the Secretary of State well knows is not necessary, because we have had nearly 50 public sector pay agreements awarded during the last year. But because there is now the opportunity to use public sector pay agreements, it's being put as pressure. As far as we're concerned, and I mean, our leader has made it quite clear, we want to see devolution restored. In fact, devolution only stopped because the government refused to listen. And furthermore, not only did the government refuse to listen, but the government expected Unionists to stay in positions in Northern Ireland where they would have to implement the very thing which we believe is destructive of our economy and will destroy the Union as well. That was, it was an act of last resort. But nevertheless, the government must be aware that unless the economic impact of the border in the Irish Sea is removed, and I know that the shadow Northern Ireland spokesman said today, well, sure, the red lane, if you have the red lane, that's only for goods moving into the Republic, and surely that gives the integrity of the UK internal market. That's not true. There are many businesses in Northern Ireland, until they show where their goods have gone, and will have to use the red lane. I spoke to a businessman this morning in the constituency of my friend for Strangford, who told me that he had a consignment of goods came in this week where he had 151 individual items for which he had to identify the country of origin, changing product codes, weights, and a whole range of information. A small businessman. And he said, look, and he sent me the message from a major supplier in Manchester, where he bought 10% of his goods, who finally said to him, I can't trade with you anymore, it is not worth my while, given the amount of paperwork. None of his goods. He operates in Heaton-Harris. None of his goods sell in the Irish Republic, but yet he's subject to all these. And of course, given that, he has to look for new supply chains. And as has been pointed out here many times before, the Irish government are not behind the door in exploiting that. Absolutely. In fact, he tells me that on a regular basis, Irish officials from the trade body in the Irish Republic ring him up and say, why don't you buy from such and such suppliers in the Republic? No wonder we've had the 50% trade diversion that we've seen already as a result of this. So economically it's working, it's hurting us. And of course in the long term, constitutionally, it hurts as well, because the application of EU law in Northern Ireland, and we've seen it in the last week, when it comes to animal safety standards, can't apply in Northern Ireland, even though the law passes through here. When it comes to the regulations regarding illegal immigration, can't apply to Northern Ireland, and the danger of a passport control arrangement having been put in Northern Ireland if we become a magnet for illegal immigration. And we even now have bills passing through here which extend to Northern Ireland but can't apply to Northern Ireland. Now, we cannot tolerate that. And unless those issues are dealt with, and the Secretary of State knows this well, unless those issues are dealt with, how could any unionist expect to accept that trade between the country we belong to continues to be disrupted, businesses hurt by it, and in the long term our constitutional arrangements and divergence occurs between ourselves and the country to which we belong. That's the challenge. I think that my honourable friend has indicated he's prepared to work at resolving that challenge. He has resolved to work at it, and he has indicated he takes personal abuse for working at it. That's a job which politicians now find themselves in Northern Ireland. But I say to this government, we did not create this problem. The government created this problem. And the government cannot allow courageous people, such as the member for Lagan Valley, to hang out to dry because they're not prepared to take on their masters in the EU.
I'd be grateful if the honourable gentleman could try to confine his remarks to 5 minutes. Jim Shannon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'll certainly do my best. I have to put on record my concerns, Mr Deputy Speaker, on behalf of the people that I represent, because the correspondence that I've had over the last few days, the emails this morning, the text messages, all are clear on where we are. They're concerned as unionists about where we are with the protocol. They're concerned where we are in relation to, and my member friend for East Antrim referred to one of my constituents in ours, and he sent me through the text message this morning. He ordered 300 items from one wholesaler in Manchester, and the level of bureaucracy that he goes through, and each one of those items, not just them all collectively, but each one of those items concerns me. They say the point is the pressure. Now, I have many constituents tell me what the point is. What's the point? Some may say, well, I can tell you, they're telling me what the point is. They say the point is to pressurise the DUP to give up and go back in. The point is to strong-arm the unionist people by withholding the necessary money that the Secretary of State has power to allocate but won't. And I have the greatest respect for the Secretary of State. He knows that, and I try to be always courteous in my dealings with everyone. But I can understand why some constituents believe this as they see government here legislate for something as non-urgent as RSE in schools, and yet won't give the pay raises to the public sector workers. The unions want it. The £3.3 billion is there. The 600 million that is necessary for the wage increases are there. I would suggest, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Secretary of State allocate that money immediately. However, I feel that what perhaps is not understood is the mindset of the Northern Ireland people. As a people who were bombed and attacked by the IRA Nazis over 30 years, we are not easily pressurised. We are not easily cowed. And when it comes to the protection of that which my family and many other families shed their blood for, we will not be easily blackmailed either. It's for all those people who gave their life for Queen and country as it was then and King and country as it is now, who died for freedom, for liberty and for democracy. That is what my constituents would like me to make clear today. As a representative, I want to be clear on that as well. I'm given to understand that progress has been made, and I welcome that, because we do want to see a progress made in a constructive way, but I understand we're not there yet, maybe far from it perhaps, but there has been progress. This is understandable. Again, I come back to having an issue with the way in which my constituents are feeling due to how this has been handled. Instead, I've been anxious to hear the detail of how far things have moved and what has been achieved. The result of the seeming blackmail is a distrust. The feeling that the DUP actually have held the line to do their best for the nation, when in fact is that I do believe we are heading towards something which secures, hopefully constitutionally and also practically on the ground, something that allows our traders to stop having to fill in reams of unnecessary paperwork and operate within the UK as normal. Under the winter framework, our shopkeepers continue to have sign-off on the TSS declaration for within UK, yet when they purchase goods from the Republic, there is no paperwork. So you can understand why we're just a little bit less British in Northern Ireland and what you are in Wales, Scotland, or indeed in England. The assumption is, from an All-Ireland point of view, when in reality the presumption should be UK focused. We want to be UK focused. We want to continue buying where we did in the past, where that trader from Heaton-Harris and Bangor, the two shops that he has. And I think it's really important that our traders are paying the accountants, and it has to be stated, and spending money and time and man hours to do something which simply should and needs not to be done. One ridiculous example among many is pet treats, deemed it not safe to sell in Northern Ireland, but yet you can cross the ferry into Scotland to my neighbouring constituents, they're safe there. And yet now, before they took Northern Ireland Protocol, they were also safe. We're working towards something that allows the health service the ability to secure the same medications as NHS England, something that enables vets to access anything needed for the animals without additional cost for paperwork or different sources. Again, this reaffirms our place within the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and stops reunification through the back door. These are the things that DUP, my party, led very ably by the member for Lagan Valley, have been working towards, and the undoubted changes that have been secured will not be easily trusted by the Unionist people, not because the DUP attempt to pull the wool over people's eyes, but because the Unionist people that we support and support us believe the media hype and the actions of government which appear to underline that hype. The Secretary of State is aware, and I'm coming to the end, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State is aware that we in the DUP will not be blackmailed, and the fact that we have continued to negotiate and secure further changes is testament to the fact that we will not accept any deal. We only accept the right deal. I fervently hope that that the next few weeks bring about the last complex changes that are required for the Unionist people and indeed for the good of people throughout the province, no matter what their political persuasion. But during this formation debate, there should be no doubt that should that fail in negotiating the correct deal, we are not afraid to face our electorate. I look forward to seeing the deal and seeing how the words on the page will affect life in Northern Ireland. Whilst I support a 2-week extension, I understand the very clear reasons why I ask government to get the messaging right. Instead of seeming to work against us, and it seems like that, work with us to find a solution and to get this right for every person of every colour and creed in Northern Ireland. We want to have a restored assembly, but it must be the right one. And the concerns of Unionists with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and that has to be addressed as well. The power for necessary change lies at the feet of the Secretary of State and with government. We will do our best to bring about a change and to find a deal, but they cannot and will not and must not ignore the voice of unionism. Thank you.
Fleur.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to thank all the members for contributing to this debate. We are now united in wanting the best for the people of Northern Ireland. In particular, we heard a very powerful speech from the Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley, and no one who heard it could be in any doubt about his determination to fight hard for unionism. And the whole House will be sorry to hear that he's been threatened, Mr Deputy Speaker. Anyone trying to bully him clearly doesn't know him. As the Secretary of State has outlined, Labour supports this bill, and we support the ongoing efforts to restore the executive as soon as possible. In the short amount of extra time that will be afforded by this legislation, the restoration of power sharing and devolved government must be the absolute priority for the government. And while I commend the important work that civil servants are doing to keep the mechanics of the state functioning, the truth is that communities across Northern Ireland need the executive and they need the MLAs to be back in their rightful place, taking the important decisions that are so desperately needed for the effective delivery of public services, for health, for education, for protecting the environment. On my visits to Northern Ireland, I've had the chance to meet many inspiring community groups who are struggling because of cuts and because of the cost of living crisis. And while all of these groups are making an enormous difference within and across their communities, they've all told me that the one thing that would make the biggest difference to their work and for people suffering from that cost of living crisis is a restored and functioning executive. Just last week, we saw the biggest industrial action in Northern Ireland's recent history, with an estimated 150,000 public sector workers joining the strike. There is clear and obvious wide-scale dissatisfaction and impact with the consequences of the current political situation across Northern Ireland. And given that the government is only legislating to push the deadline back by 15 days, it's vital that we see quick progress and that the limited time available is not squandered. As the Shadow Secretary of State has said, whatever happens, the money for public sector pay, which the Secretary of State has made clear is available, should be released so that workers in Northern Ireland finally get the pay increase that they deserve. The current situation must not be allowed to become the accepted norm. Failure to restore devolved government could and is causing damage that could take years to undo. So to conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, Labour will support this bill, and I urge the Secretary of State to do all he can to ensure that an agreement is reached and to keep the House informed at every stage. I thank you.
House, Chris Heaton-Harris.
With the leave of the House, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to close this second reading debate. At the beginning I spoke for a whole 2 minutes because I did want to hear what everybody had to say. I was hoping it wouldn't go on quite as well as it did, but there were very important speeches within it. But the bill itself, which I will come to in a moment, the bill itself simply says in Clause 1, in Section 1, brackets 1 of the Northern Ireland Executive Formation, etc. Act 2022 for the 18th of January 2024, substitute the 8th of February 2024. A short extension in time. There's a second clause about the commencement and short title. And so my 2-minute speech was simply to keep within the scope of that debate. But we've managed to touch on Scottish independence, public sector pay, leaving the European Union, the Malthouse Compromise, the Northern Ireland Select Committee agenda, and reform of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, all within 2 hours. And so I shall learn yet another lesson about debating in Northern Ireland debate on the floor of this House by just saying what I think all the time at the very beginning. We had a number of excellent interventions in this debate. I'll talk about the speeches we heard, but the interventions from Member for Woking, Aberconwy, South Antrim, were all interesting and important. But actually, I just want to put on record to the member for St Helens North that the whole House wishes his father well. And I know he's not in his place now, but it's very important that we do recognise that we are all human in this business. Also, I'd like to thank all those that did speak in the debate. Right honourable member for Leeds Central, Skipton and Ripon, right honourable member for Gordon, right honourable member for South Swindon, for North Down, for Foyle, who member for Foyle gave an excellent speech, and I associate myself with many of the comments he made within it, for Belfast East, and a characteristically passionate speech by the right honourable member for East Antrim, who I really do appreciate the way he put his words in his contribution and what he actually said. And of course the member for Strangford. But the one, I guess, standout contribution was from the right honourable member for Lagan Valley. And I thank him profusely for the conversations we've had over the course of the last weeks and months. I know he really does want to get the best deal for Northern Ireland that works for both the nationalist and the unionist communities, that's based on the basis of consent, that means he can restore, find the conditions to restore the institutions. I know he and his party believe in devolution. And I truly believe, and he listed the number of things that he has managed to achieve in his leadership of his party. He should be and can be rightly proud of what he has already achieved in that space. The fact he's been threatened for doing the job he should be doing is a disgrace. It's extraordinary. And we know, I mean, we're all in this place, unfortunately, have to come across, but these people are cowards and idiots. And I know they will not deter the honourable gentleman. I've noticed in my period of time as Secretary of State that the number of followers you have on Twitter or X does not necessarily equate to the number of brain cells you might have, or the amount of common sense or decency you display as a human being. They are characteristics that are personal. They are characteristics that you can display as a human being, and unfortunately some people choose to have a different persona when they're on social media, and emailing, say some really stupid things. And I promise the honourable gentleman, right honourable gentleman, I shall work with him and indeed use whatever power I have to make sure that he does not feel insecure in going about his business properly, because no parliamentarian should do. But I'd like to thank all honourable members for their contributions, as I said. When we gathered to mark the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement last year, we noted the hard-won gains of the peace process and that should be honoured by the restoration of the devolved institutions. And there is broad agreement on the main substance of this bill. Our priority must be to continue also to restore devolution in Northern Ireland. And as asked by the Shadow Front Bench, this is the immediate issue that I am completely concentrating on. They did ask, the right honourable gentleman did ask about what other legislation there might be. There could be future legislation. I do not want to be in that place. He asked me to make a statement to make sure, or when things, or should things move, that I will keep the House updated. I absolutely guarantee that I will do that should things move forward. And of course, you know, he wouldn't expect me to not have prepared for all eventualities, and I will update the House again as to my plans if it's not proved possible to restore the executive by the new deadline. But I really do hope that those plans will not be needed. He asked me, and a number of members mentioned public sector pay, and the government recognises the vital work that public sector workers carry out, and they should be fairly paid in recognition of this work. The UK government, however, does not have the authority to negotiate pay in Northern Ireland. And I recognise that the uncertainty in relation to pay awards is causing a pressure on Northern Ireland finances, and this is why the government put a very fair and generous financial package on the table to offer a new executive a non-repayable injection of help to restore the executive, manage that pressure. But alongside, I'll have to give way to the honourable gentleman.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and not to spoil the mood, but the trade unions would be quite upset if we didn't take the opportunity to say they're not asking the Northern Ireland office to negotiate their pay. They will negotiate with their employers, as is right in the normal course of events. They are asking that the money that was secured and agreed in December be released to their employers so they can get on and do the negotiation.
And I hear what the honourable gentleman says, but that is a package that is available, a complete package that is available for a restored executive. Mr Speaker, I promised to be as short as I possibly could at the beginning of this debate, and I know we have more work to do in this Parliament on different subjects, but I hope shortly to be in a position where I can return to this dispatch box celebrating the return of a wonderful institution of devolved government in Northern Ireland, and practically speaking, this step is the first step to secure rural assent on this legislation, first step along that route. I beg to move.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many other say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Under the business of the House order of today, the bill is now committed to a committee of the whole House.
Northern Ireland Executive Formation Bill Committee. Now.
Order. Order.
Northern Ireland Executive Formation Bill.
I remind members that in committee, members should not address the Chair as Deputy Speaker. Please call our names when addressing the Chair. Chair, it's got Madam Chairman here, but I think we'll pass on that while I'm here. And Mr. Chairman are also acceptable. We will begin with Clause 1 stand part, with which it will be convenient to consider Clause 2 stand part. The question is that Clause 1 stand part of the bill. Call the Minister.
Formally. Move formally, sir.
That's it. Hilary, Benn? Anybody else? Oh, come on. In that case, the question is that Clause 1 stand part of the bill. As many other say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that Clause 2 stand part of the bill. As many other opinions say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order. Well, it'll stand on the record that my contribution was longer than anybody else's during the committee's day. Order. Whip to report.
I beg to report that the committee has gone through the bill and directed me to report the bill without amendment.
Thank you very much. Under the order of the House of today, we shall now move to the third reading of the bill.
Now.
Minister to move third reading.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I nearly did what the member for East Antrim would have wanted me to do, but I will call you Mr. Deputy Speaker whilst you're here. I beg to move that the bill now be read a third time. And before I start, I wish to place on record my sincere thanks to everyone involved in the bill's passage so far through the House and their support of this expedited passage. I particularly want to thank the front benchers of all parties for their collaborative and constructive engagement. We've had a reasonable outing today at second reading on a whole host of issues concerning Northern Ireland. And I'd like to think that the tone of the debate that we have had over the course of the last 2 hours will be reflected in the positive tone that we can take in our negotiations and talks over the next few hours, days, however long it may be, so we can get to that wonderful place that I do believe that we would all want to get to. Can I reiterate my comments about the Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley and the words he said? I really have enjoyed working with him, listening to him, understanding the points being made that he makes when he represents unionism so powerfully as he does. It is vitally important, I know, to him that we get this right. And I know that sometimes that particularly can be, I don't know, some of the conversations I think we can say have been repetitive occasionally, but maybe all these conversations have a point. And I'd like to think, and I'd like to hope he would acknowledge that I have a very deep and fundamental understanding of the issues that he and his party have been outlining over the course of the last days and weeks and months. And I would like to think they are being reflected in the conversations that we are having now. I don't think there's anybody in this House that does not want to see Stormont returned, the Assembly sitting, the Executive up and running, ministers making the choices that the people that elected them would like to see. And I give way, obviously, to...
Secretary of State, and I'm ever mindful of the Secretary of State and just his comments there was saying the goodwill that there's been in this debate, the goodwill there's been exchanged between members as well to try and find a way forward. Could I ask the Secretary of State perhaps to use some of that goodwill to ensure that the monies that the Secretary of State has got, the 3.3 billion, the £600 million that is needed to address the payment pay agreement with the medical sector and also with the teachers, build upon that goodwill, make that gesture, ensure that the unions have the pay increase that they've been seeking, and which there is consensus in all parties in this side of the chamber for that to happen. Could I ask that the Secretary of State use your goodwill, build upon it, and make that gesture today?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his contributions, but I'm afraid I've said all I am going to say on that matter for today. But I do want to make the point that it has been nearly 2 years since the institutions have been up and running. There's been a lot of water that has passed under the bridge, and I, like he does, meet people across Northern Ireland, from those from both communities and those who are new to Northern Ireland, who've chosen to move there, to work there, to live there, who want to see their institutions up and running. And I actually know it's important for democracy too, because we all need to see the results of an election that was fairly fought delivered. We are all Democrats in this place. I prefer to win elections rather than lose them, and I very much hope I manage to maintain my lucky streak that I've had since representing the seat I do of Daventry. But democracy is vitally important to our system. Making sure that every voter feels heard through the ballot box is vitally important. So I want to place on record my thanks to those that have been engaged in this debate. I also would like to place on record my appreciation to the House authorities in this particular case and the Office of Parliamentary Counsel for their continued expert advice. Honourable members involved in this debate, right honourable members involved in this debate, knew that there could have been a different piece of legislation laid today, and that's probably where we were progressing to. So the slight course correction that we have taken did involve a huge amount of help from those people behind the scenes that make this place function so well, and I just want to put on the record my thanks to them. I also want to thank my colleagues and officials from the Government Whip's office for helping us progress in such a smooth fashion. As ever, I am grateful to them for everything they do, and I understand their pain as a former Government Whip and Government Chief Whip. But I think I can conclude by repeating what I said at second reading, that people in Northern Ireland rightly expect and deserve to see locally elected decision makers address the issues that matter to them. And I agree with them, and I genuinely believe this House does too. And I beg to move this bill now be read.
The question is that the bill be now read the third time. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now I can see the relief on the Government Whip's faces. I will keep my remarks extremely short. I want once again to thank the Secretary of State for being punctilious, in the proper sense of the word, in his dealings with me and keeping me informed about what he has planned. To echo his thanks to civil servants, although I should think in civil service careers this is probably the easiest bill to draft, because that one line can't have taken terribly long. And the third thing I want to say is that to join in the praise there has been to the Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley for the speech that he made, the passion that he showed, and his willingness to set out the argument which has united, I think, all parts of the House today, that is in the interests of the people of Northern Ireland to have their government back. And I wish him I wish the Secretary of State, in whatever further conversations they are due to have in the next few days, every success in bringing this to a conclusion, because the people who in the end will really feel the benefit of an agreement are the people of Northern Ireland. We criticise governments, but we look to them when we want things to be done, to help us to deal with problems, to advance the interests of society, and that is why the people of Northern Ireland have the same right as everyone else to see their government in place. And referring back to my comments right at the beginning, I think I bring my contribution to this passage of this bill to a close in a slightly better state of hope than perhaps when it began. And I wish all those involved every success. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
I'm looking at anybody who wishes to contribute on any side. The question is that the bill be now read the third time. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We're now going to move on. So